The where'd my little cheat sheet go? We were talking about historic events and that sort of thing. You remember seeing Halley's Comet?
Yes, I saw it one afternoon or wherever it was. I looked up to where it was supposed to be, and there I could see a little white streak in the tail of it, and that was about all. I was not too impressed. It was interesting to know that comets do come by now and then, but that was the end of it.
Um,
I didn't follow up anything on it at all.
you let's see. You were born in 1907. Do you remember anything about Woodrow Wilson?
I heard a lot about President Wilson. He signed the patent for my grandfather's homestead. He's the one that signed the document that legalized his ownership of that 140 acres up in Oregon that my grandfather had worked on for over 4 years and done $100 worth of improvement, which was required, and then finally got a patent, got full ownership of that homestead. And Woodrow Wilson's the one who signed it. The other thing I know about Woodrow Wilson is that when he ran for president the second time, I think the slogan was, he kept us out of war. That we could have gotten into another war, but for his international, he was an ardent advocate of the United Nations, only it was then called the League of Nations. And he was a wonderful peace advocate in the world.
When you were a young child, what kind of airplanes did you see?
We saw airplanes now and then. They were almost all biplanes, as I recall. Even the first, I forget when the first transport began. There was sort of a hop and jump. Transcontinental service was the first early on, in which the flights themselves were not more than a couple of hours. I myself was on a rather pioneer cross-country air travel when the water department had some problems and I had to go east immediately to help solve them. And I went on a sleeper. That was an interesting time. It was one of the earliest sleepers. It was a monoplane. I mean, it had only a single wing, but it was a large airplane. And up forward, just behind the pilots, was 4 berths. And I had one of those 4 berths on a sleeper because it took about 6 hours to fly cross country. And the main thing I remember about it is that the berth wasn't too comfortable. It was big enough and all that. And there was only 4 of us, 2 on each side, just behind our pilots. And I had the upper berth on the right side and had a little window. And the thing that I remember the most is we simply kept landing so often. We obviously landed at Salt Lake and then again into Chicago and maybe someplace else. And then finally we ended up in Washington, D.C. And it seemed to take all night long to do it. And I didn't find it very wonderful.
What was the food any different back when you were a child?
Was it which?
Food. Was food very different?
Student.
Food. Food that you eat. Food. Was the food different?
Food.
Better, worse, different?
Oh, I don't remember the change in food. I remember the change in my own habits. I remember just hearing the word meat, potatoes, and gravy. But it doesn't mean that we always had meat, potatoes, and gravy. The main food that I remember was what goes with my earliest memory of existence, and that was cornmeal mush. I had it for breakfast every morning, and my earliest memory of my existence was my bowl of cornmeal mush on my tray of my high chair. And that was, I used to call it before, I'd have my dish, my spoonful of slimy oatmeal. It was always slimy in my words. And that was my breakfast, slimy oatmeal. But seems to me we had macaroni and cheese fairly often because I loved it, and we don't seem to have that anymore. But it was what we didn't have in my early days, because I wouldn't have remembered it anyhow, because it would already be cut and fixed. But we didn't have is things like a complete leg of lamb. Shortly after Cece and I were married, when our kids were being brought up, one of our standard items was getting a leg of lamb and roasting it, and it would last us for a week. We'd have the hot, fresh roast of lamb to start with, and then we'd have lamb sliced sandwiches and things the rest of the week.
What do you remember about early Nazi Germany, pre-war Germany? I mean, what were y'all thinking in America about Germany in the early 1930s? Early 1930s.
The realm that I was in, it was the Nazis. You talk about that era, and Hitler.
Well, in the early 1930s, before everybody realized just how monstrous they were.
1930s. Let's see. I was just out of school. Oh yes, the main thing in my group is that because the war was going on in Europe, we almost knew that we were going to get involved. And that's why those of us who were being trained in the Air Corps we know that we're going to almost all could look forward to active duty, because for years they'd been, the U.S. had been in peace, and sometimes there was almost a question, well, what the hell are they training us for? And then somebody would say, well, don't worry, there'll be a war. And the war was going on in Europe, and of course there was a war. But
well, what was the perception of Hitler early on, before it became so obvious that he was a terrible person?
I remember hearing the phrase that it was among the Jewish population, I think, of course, sure, but in all fairness, I remember hearing the phrase every once in a while when they'd see the news. They'd say, he must be insane, and they meant psychologically. I remember hearing a lot, Hitler's insane, because he had this great push, this great yearn almost, or activity, to rid the world of Jews. See, and I remember a lot of people saying, smilingly in a sense, well, he's just ahead of his time. In other words, the world would be, it really meant the world would be better off if there weren't any Jews in it. And they were ostensibly just plain old U.S. citizens. I was a little bit appalled, not because my Cecil was part Jewish, or because I had some Jewish friends. I mean, because it wasn't, the idea of, well, in the first place, subconsciously, I'm appalled at anybody that puts much stock, puts too much concern in an ethnic background. I myself, you see, am 1/8 American Indian. I probably could trace my origin back to, certainly to the Oriental days, which that's where the Indians came from. That's about the only so-called foreign ethnic things I can claim. Cecil was herself 1/8 Jewish, 1/8 or 1/4, I think. I don't forget which. And so the point is, ethnic backgrounds both bored me on the one hand, and I rebelled against them on the other hand. What difference does it make? Maybe I told you this. I thought I had an interesting little experiment of my own. At one place I ran across, which you see about once a year or so in certain magazines, I read a tabulation of the ethnic breakdown of the people of the world. I think it was in an early issue of Life magazine. And it gave, not understandably, that about half of the world is Asian, Chinese and Japanese, and it could be classed as Asian. And then I'm not sure of the exact figures, but the gist of it was that half Asian, about 20% or so European, another 20 or so percent African, and then some other European, and that made up to 100%. And I thought at that time, that's interesting. I wonder what people right now, what group of people, ethnic group of people, right now pretty well represent that combination of the total world. In other words, who would be roughly half Asian almost, and then percentage of European and so on. And I thought, well, Thailand. Have you ever been to Siam? Well, I'd been there, and I met the people. I had an office there, in fact, a sub-office. And I thought, well, Thailand, both geographically, they are just below China on the one hand, and next to Europe on the other hand, and above Africa on the other hand. Thailand people could probably pretty well represent what the world would be like if we were all one ethnic background. That very year, Fortune magazine had a contest for Miss World, held in New York, where the best-looking women of the world came to be chosen as the Miss World. The winner, Miss Thailand.
You know who else is Thai?
A girl from Thailand, and she was beautiful. So I said to myself, what the hell are we worrying about? Let's get together and mix up.
You know who else is from Thailand?
What?
You know who else has Thailand blood?
Who?
Tiger Woods.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Tell me about your experience when the revelation first came out about the Holocaust that was going on in Germany.
The Holocaust, unfortunately, I didn't get too interested in it. I didn't worry much about it.
Was it not a shocking?
I did hear, yes, I did hear, and I agreed that I heard mumbling that Hitler must be mad, that a sane person wouldn't do what he's doing, and the idea of trying to literally eliminate, I thought it was appalling. And I'll tell you what was I won't say the counter feeling, but I guess it was a counter feeling, and that is couldn't understand how the Jews would put up with it. Now I do know that once they were getting into the rounded up position, that here were these Nazi officers with their rifles and would shoot without a certain second thought any Jews that would get out of line in a row. Here's a row of people getting ready to be put into a boxcar to be shipped off to a gas chamber even, and not one of them made the step to rebel. And I knew perfectly well that the first guy that made a false step would be shot that instant. But they couldn't all be shot. That's my feeling to this day. I don't know why. I think in all fairness to me, I may have been a coward at the time, but as of now, if I found myself in that condition, where I would have my head shaved and a Star of David carved on my side or whatever it is, and be rounded up with a bunch of people being marched off to a boxcar to be shipped off to a gas chamber, and I knew that if any one of us should make the move to grab the revolver of the Nazi standing right there ready to shoot me, if any one of us made the move and the rest of them would follow up, we could overcome and eradicate the whole goddamn German army. But we didn't do it. That's my feeling about the Holocaust. And I can't blame any. I say that I feel that I would, if I knew what was coming, that was it. If I knew what was really going to come, I think I would have myself been willing to take the first move. Because I'm not afraid of death. I've never been afraid of death in my life, and I'm less afraid of death now than I've ever been. I have no compunctions at all about dying. And if I could have been killed by making the first move of grabbing the rifle, the revolver out of the hand of the Nazi, just that one move, and from that point on, the word would have been passed to all the others. The Germans would have been turned tail and ran. They'd get on their knees and beg for forgiveness. Within minutes, that whole thing could have been turned around. Within minutes.
Let's talk a little bit about all the different places in the world you've been. You and Cecil did a lot of traveling, both for vacation.
We have the reputation for that, and we did a fair amount. But the funny thing is that I've never been any further in Mexico than Mexico City. And so I have never been anywhere south. I've never been near Central America, never touched any part of South America. But so much for the parts where I haven't been. The other part is, yes, I've been in every other continent. I've been in Asia and Africa and Australia and Canada and Oceania on the most, of course, the islands, the Trust Territory, and so on.
Tell me the different countries that you've been to. The first country outside the United States or first place outside the United States was at Guam,
Yes.
and then in your travels to Guam, back and forth, you probably went to.
Yeah, I became chief engineer after the immediate Guam program. I became chief engineer under the Trust Territory. Guam is just part of the U.S. It's a U.S. position. But then when I left that and went my first move out of Guam was to New Orleans, of all places, which was a fun job. And then at New Orleans, I was a desperate appointee. They needed somebody desperately to go to Africa. Under what was called the Agency for International Development, AID. And of course, aid has a different connotation now, but then it was the agency. So I went there as chief engineer for East Africa, and that's where I had my Cessna assigned, a little Cessna 180. And when I asked for it, I got a phone call from Washington. They say, "Mr. Wade, we furnish our engineers with all the jeeps and trucks they want, but we don't furnish them with airplanes." Well, my future boss was a frustrated pilot himself, and he says, "You give Mr. Wade his airplane." So I was assigned this Cessna 180, and I flew it as much as 8 hours in one day, more than the legal limit for piloting an airplane.
What part of Africa is this?
Northeast Africa, Somalia, basically. Northeast Africa.
What were you doing there?
I was chief engineer for that part of the world under the foreign aid program. I was basically I was a Navy employee on loan to the foreign aid program, and I was therefore in time assigned to be chief engineer for East Africa, headquartered in Mogadishu.
And what kind of things do chief engineers do?
What kind of what?
What kind of things do chief engineers do?
Oh, well, in other words, what did I do? I was responsible for the engineering and construction work that went on for the fisheries, for education, for transportation, for the building of a harbor, literally from scratch, going out and finding a quarry and getting bulldozers and dynamite and dump trucks to haul in rocks to build a breakwater, to create a seaport, roads, water systems. That's what chief engineers do. On Guam, my first overseas job, when I got there, the entire island had been occupied by the U.S. before the First World War, then been occupied by the Japanese during the Mandate years, and then had been occupied by the U.S. with, I can't imagine the ignorance of the people in charge, but when I arrived there, the main backbone of living anywhere was water, and the water system on Guam was in shambles. They were pumping salt water out of the wells. The wells that were pumped here and there throughout the island had been overpumped, and they were pumping salt water. And so the place was a mess. And I straightened it out.
What were you in it when you were in Somalia? Did you go to any other countries regularly, or just mainly Somalia?
Let's see, I keep getting my S's mixed up. Somalia, that's East Africa. Yes, I did a lot of work in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, which is a branch of British Somalia, and in Kenya. Mostly I didn't do any work for the Kenya government as such, but I had some engineering contacts there. And then Zanzibar, but Somalia and Kenya, yeah. East Kenya, but mostly Somalia.
And is that how Joni first got out to East Africa?
Did it help her?
Is that what got Joni to?
Oh yeah, she came. She was. See, we have 3 daughters, and here we were living in the most preferred situation. I didn't realize how luxurious it was at the time, but here we were in Mogadishu. We not only had a house of our own, but the house had a wall around it. It had a backyard, and I built a canopy, a vine that covered the entire back porch, backyard about 20 by 50 feet. I strung wires. It had a high fence around it, a high stone fence, and I strung wires from the edge of the building, which was made out of stone blocks too, over and covered this entire backyard with wires, and on that vines grew up. So we had a completely vine-covered backyard. And at one point I decided to give a party for the nobles, as it were, of the administration there, the governor and the new heads of the various state departments. So we gave a party, and I had many people tell me that they had never been to such a party before in their lives. For one thing, we had a full-time houseboy and a full-time cook for ourselves, and they in turn got 2 more of their native handy people, and I had them put it on. We had 2 bars, 2 sandwich bars, a dessert bar, and we invited about 100 people, and gave a party underneath this canopy of vines.
Let me make a quick diversion here, but I've got a lot of pictures that I'll use in my documentary at some point of you and Cecil dressed up, funny parties, dress-up parties, doing a lot of crazy things. So I just talk about that. Y'all you'd have fun a lot.
Oh yes, we had a wonderful life together. One of those pictures might be aboard the ship. I insisted, we'd crossed around so much and did so much that I insisted that on one of my trips overseas, I wanted to go by boat. I didn't want to fly. And I just said to the personnel office in Washington, D.C., I said, I've done enough of this company so far. She said, I want my wife and I to go by boat first class. She says, all right. So we went on a first-class boat. And on the boat, the second night out, they had a costume party. And maybe one of the pictures is that. I mean, that's all I remember being in costume. Because we ate at the captain's table. We went first class, and there was 12 of us, I think, that sat at eating at the captain's table is such a boastful thing that they had to make a lot of people at the captain's table. And we were one of the 8 or 10 people at the captain's table. And it was the only time in my life I ever crossed the ocean by surface, and I crossed it first class. And it was interesting because the boat we went on was an Italian liner, and they had all 3 levels of passage. They had first class, second class, and steerage. And in one of the days, we went on a sort of a tour of the boat, and the guide took us to the stern of our level, and we could look down 2 floors at that part of the boat, 2 floors down to a stern deck where they didn't have steerage, but it's where the third class people were being shipped. And the thing that was interesting was, Cecil and I looked at each other and said, that must be fun, is that we looked down, and here was this long hallway between a row of bunkhouses. I think they just had bunks. They didn't have staterooms at all. But there was a long row hallway, and the entire length of that hallway was a table with white tablecloths, and about every 10 feet or so was a big pitcher of wine. Then off on the same floor, in an alcove, we could see a tank about 4 feet in diameter and about 4 feet deep, a nice wood tank with a spigot. It was wine. Those passengers could have all the wine they could drink. There were pitchers full of red wine every few feet on that table. Of course, we had all the wine we could drink too, and I guess champagne too. I don't know. I wasn't a drinker.
Where did you go after Somalia?
I get my S's mixed up. Did I go to Somalia before or after Saipan? I have Somalia, Saipan, and another S.
Samoa.
Samoa. Thank you. So where was I?
You were in Somalia, East Africa.
Somalia. When I finished Somalia, I came to the States for reassignment, and I went to American Samoa. That was it. I went to American Samoa. I was chief engineer for American Samoa.
What is Samoa? Is that Thailand?
No, Samoa.
Is it still called Samoa, or is it called something else?
No, it's Samoa, American Samoa, because there's a Western Samoa that belongs to Britain.
Okay.
But American Samoa belongs to the U.S. It's a little island. There's a couple of small islands, too, besides that. Manua and one other. There's a famous book by a famous author, and I forget both of them at the moment, called Coming of Age in American Samoa. And the book is written about the situation in what was called a Manua, which is an island part of the American Samoa chain. But the actual activities of the boy and the girl coming of...
Isn't that Margaret Mead? Wasn't she in Samoa?
It was Margaret Mead, correct. And the house that she lived in was where Cece and I stayed. The house that she lived in while she wrote her book was where we lived in American Samoa when we were there. And I have a canoe right here on this property to this moment that I got. There was the prize-winning canoe in a contest among the islands. They each built a canoe as best they could, and they had a meeting in Pongo Pongo Harbor, and this was the prize winner of all the 3 or 4 entries. I bought it right there for $50, and I did it because I had a chance to have a Standard Oil Company that came about once a year to both unload oil barrels and fuel, gasoline, into storage tanks, was on a return trip to San Francisco. And I had the captain put this boat on that tanker and bring it to San Francisco free. And then I went down there and picked it up, and here it is to this day, right down here underneath the studio. A prize-winning canoe from American Samoa.
Now, what were you doing in Samoa as chief engineer? What kind of things would you do?
Again, which one of the Samoa, Saipan, American Samoa, Pongo Pongo Harbor. Okay, there I built the main thing. I did 2 things. I was the one that showed how to build a road over an impassable piece of the island, so that I finally ended up with a road circumventing the entire island. And I did that by taking the bulldozer operator, who was a very wonderful friend and good operator, and without any drawings really, well, I made a few sketches, I went out with him and showed him what to do to close in a part that had never been traversed before, so we could have a road around the entire island. And once I showed him what to do, he couldn't wait to get at it quick enough. What it amounted to was taking a hill that was around the edge of the bay and was in the way of transporting, having transport around the island. This hill, this cliff, was in the way, and then also there was a long swamp part of the island below it. And of course, the obvious thing to me was, I took Pinky, that was his name. He was a bulldozer operator. I said, Pinky, look, if you do this, and I made a sketch of the amount of cut and the amount of fill. If they filled in this and cut this, there could be just a nice sloping road at a nice angle up and over and onto the other side. And he couldn't wait to get at it. And about 2 weeks later, it was finished. Well, I did that. Also, see, American Samoa. Like all places, they were having water problems. They didn't have adequate catchment. and I worked on that. So it was a road, the water system. Oh, then and then housing. Yes, I built the first demonstration house. They needed housing for the teachers. They wanted to get about a dozen teachers in, and they had no housing for them. So I made a model house, prefab concrete pieces, prefab beams, and pillars, and I got the quarry organized so that we could get crushed rock and cement and built houses.
You can
I was only there a year.
fix your ear. It's up a little loud.
Yeah, thank you.
That's good. And then where did you go after Samoa? Must have gone to Saipan, because that's the 3 S's. Or did you go somewhere else in between?
I think I went from Samoa to Saipan, correct. I went to the Trust Territory. Saipan is the headquarters of the Trust Territory. The Trust Territory involves all of the islands in the Pacific area except Guam. Guam is a position of its own. But the Trust Territory involves primarily Saipan and Rota, and then the Marshalls. That was a big possession of the Kwajalein, where the rockets are, to this day are being set up, part of the missile defense program, which is the subject of a letter I'm working on right now. I was on Kwajalein many times, and I helped the college students. There was a lot of college students involved in this anti-missile and current program called 2020. And I helped them with their logistics of getting organized, both where to put their cameras and their places for them to live. And what it amounted to, and this is another, I have some notes already right now. I'm trying to get a letter out on it, because I was there in Kwajalein, and I know what the so-called benefits of it is. On Kwajalein, there was a group of about 3 or 4 college kids. I forget what school, and their job was to photograph part of the missile. I'm sorry, part of the missile defense program. That's it. Part of the missile defense program was to photograph a dummy missile. I mean, a real missile, but unarmed, of course. A real missile that was launched right here at Vandenberg. At Vandenberg Air Force Base, they'd launch a missile. Kwajalein would then shoot it down, in quotes, by getting a photograph of it. And that was their job. They had very powerful stroboscopic lamps that would be charged and then discharged and shoot a beam of light, million candle power beam of light up in the air. At the same time that light would be lighting up that part of the air, a missile from Vandenberg would go by, representing a potential weapon. Their job was to photograph it. So the point was, Vandenberg would have to let them know when they were going to launch the missile. They would have to have their cameras ready, with their stroboscopic lights ready, and then when all that was timed just right, if they were lucky, they'd get a picture of the missiles that went by. That was considered a successful intercept. And to that day, to this moment, that's the big push of the people that want us to spend billions of dollars and trying to control space because of our success, in quotes, of the Vandenberg to Kwajalein missile range.
So Saipan is Thailand? Is that what Saipan is now called, Thailand?
Thailand. Thailand is no. Thailand is in the mainland. Thailand is the old Siam.
Siam. That's another S.
Oh yes.
But you never went there.
Oh yes. I had an office there.
Oh, you went to Siam too.
In Bangkok.
Okay. Well, let's hold on. Okay. So now we're in Saipan. Is it still called Saipan?
Yes.
And where'd you go from Saipan?
I think I retired from Saipan.
Oh, did you retire from Saipan?
Yeah, literally.
When were you in Siam?
Huh?
When were you in Siam, Thailand?
I was there on a field trip from Guam.
To do what?
I had an office there on the Mekong River. I had two engineers there, and I went to see how they were getting along. And my job was to build a dock on the Mekong River that we could take fuel up in a barge and tie the barge up at this dock that I was designing, and then unload it. Most of the fuel came in barrels, 55-gallon barrels. So the job was for me was to get a dock that would be stable enough, and the river went up and down almost 20 feet in level, and sometimes the current would be very fast. So I had to have shore facilities with very heavy anchors on the shore and bollards, and a dock, a floating dock, that would go up and down with the level of the river, from which when the supply boat could come up alongside and tie up and not be washed downstream when the river got going fast. And from that they would unload these barrels of fuel and then come up a ramp that varied in slope depending on the level of the river, and then go up to a warehouse to be stored. That was my job in that part of the world.
Did you have any other field trips where you went to other countries? Well, just tell me, what other countries have you been to besides the ones we've already named?
Well, I forget what we've named it. The countries I've not been to, as I told you, no part of South America.
In terms of work, though, I know you went
Places where I worked was mostly Oceania. The only place did I ever work in any place in Europe? Seems to me I did. I was in Africa a lot, and seems to me I had a job in Europe, in Italy. I had a lot to do with the AID program that was headquartered in Rome. So you might say my sub-office was in Rome. But right now I can't remember.
You probably went to Rome to do business, but
Yes,
didn't have any projects there, necessarily.
That was definitely a lot. I was in Rome. I was in Sicily, in Athens. It's funny, it's hard for me to separate office negotiations and assignments and so on. I don't know.
Well, let's name some countries. Have you been to England?
Oh, yes, I've been to England a lot.
France?
In fact, I was going to, I was assigned by, boy, talk about personnel offices again. Personnel has been my nemesis all my life. I was assigned to become chief engineer for the U.S. Navy station in London, because the people who had that office, I met them myself in London. I forget their name at the moment. She was sick of the London fog, and there was a time in which it was all set up by the personnel office, the Navy personnel office and their office, in which we would shift positions. She would come to Saipan and take my job there as chief engineer, and I would go to London and be the chief engineer for the Navy's operation there. The red light is on this side. Is that all right?
Yeah, it's fine. You're doing fine.
Anyhow, and it was all set for us to change places. Old Atwood, I forget his name at the moment, and we were all so pleased because I was looking forward. I'd been to London. I saw his office, and I knew the situation there. But the fog wasn't going to bother either one of us. Caesars were looking forward to it. And so, and of course I forget their name again, they were looking ecstatic with the idea of being able to come to Saipan and get out in the warm tropical islands and so on. So this was all set up as just a matter of our just practically moving. When I got a letter from personnel, there it goes again, you see, I got a letter from personnel saying, Mr. Waite, we're so sorry, but a change has been made. And what it amounted to is that somebody in Washington, D.C., in the personnel office, heard about this opening of a GS-14 in London, and he says, "Oh my God, a GS-14 in London? I want that job myself." And he signed himself to the job. That was the end of it.
Well, let's go through a bunch of countries here. You've been to France.
Only as a visit.
That's what I'm saying. But all the countries you've been to. You've been to France.
Yeah.
Been to Germany.
I haven't been to too many countries, but you can do this if you
Okay.
like.
You've been to Germany.
Oh, yes. I bought a car in Germany. I bought a Volkswagen.
Been to Switzerland and Austria.
Yes, I drove through those.
Been to Yugoslavia.
Yes. Oh,
Tur-
yes. I had a friend in the office there.
You been to Turkey.
Yes, I went to Turkey's castle, or whatever her name is, Sophie's castle.
Been to Eastern Europe, Romania, Poland.
Probably. I went to Leningrad, of course.
Been to Russia.
Yes, I took the Trans-Siberian Railway, started in Russia. Went the whole length of Russia. Russia's a big country.
Yes, it is.
Russia's, I think, bigger than the United States.
You been to Scandinavia?
Yes, went to both sides. Took the hydrofoil from Denmark to what's the Scandinavian peninsula? Not Switzerland. Norway.
You okay? You been to Israel?
Oh yes. Boy, it's funny. When you go to Israel, I don't know whether it's going or leaving Israel. I think it's when you leave. You can do this damnable ethnic differences. When you go from Israel to Turkey or whatever it was, the porter was an open field about the size of a football field that marks where the border is. The porter will take your luggage in a wheelbarrow if necessary to the middle of this open field, absolutely barren, and takes your luggage out and leaves it and goes away. You stand there beside your luggage. When he's gone all the way back to his place, from the other side, another porter comes over, also with a cart, and puts your bags in and takes you into the other country. That's as close as they will get to each other.
Have you been to Middle Eastern countries?
Such as what?
Saudi Arabia,
I can't remember.
Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Jordan, Yemen. Been to any of those Middle Eastern countries?
Oh. Well, we're in. I spent a lot of time in. Oh God. I was in Lebanon.
Yes.
I was chief engineer for. I was scheduled to stay and build a sewage system for Lebanon. The company I was with, and something happened and it didn't pan out. But I've been Lebanon, as I recall, is called the Paris of Beirut. Isn't that the town? It's called the Paris of the Pacific, of the Mediterranean area. It's a charming place.
Been to Syria?
No, it's in Lebanon.
I'm saying, have you been to Syria?
I think so, but I
Can't remember.
What's the town in Syria? We don't
Syria,
remember.
Damascus.
I went around almost all the countries I was in all the countries that border the Mediterranean.
Okay.
Turkey, Greece.
How about South Africa? Been to South Africa?
Never been to South Africa. Never been south of Tanzania.
How about Western Africa? Congo.
No. No
Monte
part,
Carlo.
No part of Western Africa. Northeast, and east mostly.
Obviously, you've been to Japan.
I've been to all the islands of Japan, including one that's clear beyond the ordinary continent of Japan, I was on a little, I think it's called Hokkaido or some tiny island north of all the main islands of Japan. And I went there because a very good friend of ours was stationed there for the State Department. And his job was almost literally to sit there all day long with binoculars looking across to the Russian side of the... It was silly.
Now, did you work in Japan, or was it just pleasure?
I don't think I worked in Japan. I can't.
You didn't live there. You never lived in Japan.
Not for a long time, no.
You lived there for a short
I
time?
visited, well, I was only as, yes, as a visitor.
Was it, which is,
I was in the first time I was ever there was right after the hostilities were just over. We from Guam were on the very first shopping trip after the war. We were the first shopping trip from Guam. We had chartered an airplane, and MacArthur was still in charge. You know, MacArthur was the one who ruled Japan for a while, and he was still there, and people were still standing out in front of his house when he came out in the morning so they could all bow. And he was the king. He's the one that established the script so that you didn't have to use regular U.S. currency. He didn't want U.S. currency to start polluting Japanese money. And so you buy script when you go there. And we were actually the first shopping people when Japan opened up to tourism. And of course we were treated more like, we had two buses. We had a plane load of people, about 20, and we were in one bus, and another empty bus followed us. And what happened was that the women of obviously I blame the women of the party would go into all these different Japanese stores that were just getting ready for the invasion of American tourists and so on, but we were the first ones. So here were all these Japanese salespeople just rubbing their hands and doing anything they possibly could. And on the other hand, the women from Guam, who were part of this first tourist group, were beside themselves. They were in heaven, shopping heaven. And the point is, they would select something and buy it and give their name, pay for it, and that's all they had to do. They never touched it anyway. It would just be there on the counter. They'd pay for it and give their name. The next time they saw it, it was delivered to them on Guam. What happened was the sales clerk then wrapped it up, put the proper name on it. It was put in a bus, taken to the airport. A plane load of it was taken down to Guam, unloaded, and then brought to their house. So it went from a counter of a store in Japan to their doorway in Guam. I mean, talk about shopping deluxe. That was what it was.
You fix your ear again.
Thank you.
Let's cover the rest of the world here. You've been to Australia.
A couple of times.
Business or pleasure?
Visiting, not business.
Been to New Guinea?
Papua New Guinea. I don't think so. That's an island.
Yes.
No.
Big one. Have you been to New Zealand?
No, I didn't get to New Zealand either, that I know of.
Have you?
I didn't.
You've been to India?
Oh yes, I crossed India by train and stopped off at Calcutta. There's a couple of places I stopped off. Where's the Taj Mahal?
I don't know.
Well, I stopped off there. That's not Calcutta.
Delhi?
Something like, I think it's a New Delhi. We stopped off to see that.
Have you been to Mongolia?
Oh boy, have I ever. I'm suffering from Mongolian fever right this moment. I came across the Trans-Siberian Railway through Mongolia. The train was delayed supposedly for 4 hours, and it turned out to be almost 11 hours while they changed the wheels on the coaches because of the change in the railway. You see, Russia has a different system, a different rail gauge than China does. And it goes clear back to the days of the war. So they changed locomotives. You can't change the wheel gauge on a locomotive very easily, but you can change the wheels on a coach. So there we were, stopped at mid-afternoon for what was supposed to take about 3 hours. And what they do is they take big heavy forklift trucks, and they lift the entire coach, every coach of the entire train, about 8 coaches. They lift it off the ground, and the wheels stay down on the track. What they call the bogies, 4 sets of 4 wheels. Those are rolled to a switch where they can be rolled off to a big field, which is filled with all kinds of railroad wheels. And so they take these wheels and put them in this part. Then they go over here and get the wheels of the right gauge and bring them back and put them on another track. The track itself has got 2 sets of rails. One set of rails is only about 8 inches away from the other set of rails because they're different gauges. And they do that whole process for every car. And the thing is that it's too difficult to have the passengers change to another car, so they change the car by putting different wheels on. The locomotive is easy. They just this locomotive goes up onto that siding. The locomotive with the right wheels comes onto this siding. Well, because of a mix-up in the equipment and whatnot, a process that's supposed to take about 4 hours ended up taking pretty close to 8 hours. When I got off my coach, I just got off. I had a short-sleeved shirt on, and it was a nice warm afternoon. But pretty soon it got to be late, and it got to be cold. And I got pneumonia, literally. It turned out to be bronchial pneumonia, both because of the weather and the bugs and the food, and because of the temperature change. So I didn't feel too good even before I got back onto the car. I could sense it. By the time that trip was over in China, I was in a hospital in a town called Weiling. And over the doorway of the entrance to this hospital complex, in English, was a big sign saying, Weiling Hospital for Western Foreigners. It was not only for foreigners, but it was for Western foreigners. I was in that hospital for 3 days. I was almost unconscious part of the time. Cecil slept on a little cot right at the foot of my bed. She was with me 24 hours a day.
Is the Dalai Lama, is Cambodia, is Mongolia his country?
Yes, it's
his country's called, no, it's not Mongolia. What's it?
Tibet.
Tibet. Have you been to Tibet?
No.
I've not been to Tibet. Let me get you some water.
Yeah.
Let me finish up the world tour here. Have you been to Vietnam?
Oh, yes. I was in Saigon before the Vietnam War began. And boy, could I ever be a critic of that. I was there on an engineering purpose because I was building this riverside dock in Upper Vietnam, up the Mekong River. And I was having breakfast at a hotel with a French engineer who spoke English, and I think he'd even been to school in the United States someplace. So we're getting along fine. And on the table nearby us was 4 American soldiers in uniform with their MAG, Military Advisory Group, called MAG. And they were just moving in. And this was near the end of what was used to be the French Indochina. For years on geography books, they'd show that part of Europe, of Western Europe, Southeastern Europe,
Southeast Asia.
Southeast, and it'd be labeled French Indochina. For years, French wanted to have that to be their part of their country. Well, they were finally being kicked out. And as they were being kicked out, the U.S. was moving in. So on this table next to us was this 4 American officers with their new uniforms that had MAG on it, Military Advisory Group. And I was having breakfast with a French engineer who was leaving after all these years. And he spoke English just as well as I. In fact, he trained in the United States. And at one point he looked over and shook his head, pointed to him and shook his head. He says, "You people have no business being here. You'll find out." That was pre-Vietnam. And he was so correct. We had no business getting involved in that Vietnam situation. And I have a marvelous Vietnam vignette or flashback, as it were, whatever it is, that I think that these two scenes ought to be put together and shown in every high school every year, forever if necessary. These are both newsreel strips. One shows an attack bomber, sort of thing that I might have been flying if I stayed on, an attack bomber flying over the countryside, strafing the country with napalm, just incinerating everything below it as it flies by with napalm. Well, think of what I would call the infrastructure that it took to do that. Building the aircraft, building the chemicals, millions of dollars, millions of people involved in creating that ability to have that wartime movement of an attack bomber flying over the Vietnam countryside and spraying it with napalm. I mean, the chemical industry, the infrastructure was enormous. It took a nation and billions of dollars of background, of factories and mines and alloys and so on, to create that movement. At that same moment, almost, time-wise, there was a photograph, one of the newsreel photographs, showing a little Vietnamese girl with just a skirt on, just a dress, probably 50 cents at the local store, with a paring knife, type of knife, sharpening bamboo sticks. Those bamboo sticks were stuck into the swamps as anti-personnel. Soldiers didn't like to walk through swamps in which these sticks were stuck in there, because they were sharp enough to come up through the side of their boots, and they didn't like it. It was anti-personnel. What did it cost to do that? A mama, a papa, a daughter, and a penknife. They won. We lost. You see?
You've been to Cambodia?
Oh, yes.
You've been to
Vietnam. Phnom Penh.
Yeah, you've been to Phnom Penh?
Many times.
Have you been to Laos or Burma?
Laos. That's north of Vietnam, I think, isn't it?
I think so.
I know, I haven't been there.
Burma?
Well, I'm mixed up as to where Burma is, but I don't think so.
Burma, I believe Burma borders Thailand.
Well, it could be. If you name the town, I might remember that. I don't know.
That's okay. Have you been to Korea?
Yeah, let me think. How was I in Korea? Korea, Vietnam.
Korea, Seoul, and Gangneung, and I forget what the southern Korea city is.
I don't know. I went to a lot of those countries and just flying from point to point. I went down the whole length of the Mekong River from its origin up in China down through Vietnam, Cambodia, and all the way to the ocean, the Mekong River.
Have you been to the Philippines?
Philippines? Oh, yeah. Manila many times. The Royal, what's the name of the big hotel in God, I forget the capital of the Philippines at the moment. But anyhow.
Oh, it's Manila.
Okay. We had an office there. Guam, the Guam activity had an office there because we were getting an awful lot of Philippine mahogany for the construction that was going on in Guam. One of the big projects of all things, but it was turned out to be an important item, was what's called the gurney rails along the hallways of a hospital. It's the handrails, but they're also, you know what a gurney is. It's a table with wheels that they move a patient. You're in bed and they put you onto this gurney, and then you're moved to another place, operating room or to another office and so on. Well, along the rail of the hallways, they have this nice handrail that is made to act as a nice bumper to the gurneys as you move them along in case they touch and so on. and it takes miles almost of that handrail at a large hospital. Guam has one. See, Guam had a hospital built just to take care of the poor. And during the Vietnam War, the soldiers would get all beaten up and cut up and shot up and lacerated in Vietnam. They'd put them aboard an ambulance plane, barely any treatment whatsoever, just immediately get them aboard an ambulance plane and ship them to Guam. And Guam had a big 3-story hospital built. I mean, talk about so-called long-range planning in a gruesome way. Guam had one of the biggest hotels, biggest hospitals in the world to take care of soldiers being shot up in Vietnam.
To finish the map here, have you been to Indonesia?
Where?
Indonesia?
Yeah, where is Indonesia? That's a group of islands.
Mm-hmm. Did it used to be called Manchuria? No, Indonesia. Has Indonesia always been called Indonesia? Did it have a name before?
I don't think so. Unless if I did, I barely landed there. I don't know. I didn't spend any time there. Pretty sure.
Have you been to Greenland?
No, I never got up to those islands, Greenland or Iceland.
Iceland. Never been to the North Pole or the South Pole?
No.
Oh
no.
I think I've covered the map. Did I miss anything?
Well, I don't know, but there's an awful lot of places. I've never been to any part of South America. I told you that.
Well, you told me that.
Never touched it.
Have you been to Bermuda?
Where's Bermuda? It's an island.
Caribbean. You been to the Caribbean?
Where?
The Caribbean.
Not really. I've never been to Cuba. No.
How about Spain, Portugal?
Oh yes, I drove. Cece and I had our little Volkswagen, and we drove from Germany to Italy, to France, to Spain, to Portugal, and back up to France, and then to Germany, and then we crossed the Channel to England and drove all around England, and then we put the same car onto the boat and brought it to the States, drove it across the United States. From there, I shipped it off to American Samoa, and after 2 years of driving all over that part of the world, I sold it in American Samoa for $400 more than I paid for it when I bought it new, because it was only one of the few cars on American Samoa, and the buyer was so happy to have a car there that he gave me $1,700 for it, and I only paid $1,200 when it was brand new.
That's great. Let me switch tacks here for a little bit. We'll spend about 5 minutes talking about. This is for my other video, the Arnold side. Tell me a little bit about when Carol met Jack. I came across some correspondence where I know that I think you and Cecil both were concerned about Mom not finishing her college degree. But just tell me a little bit about when she first met Jack and how that sort of was, some of the dynamics
first place, I wasn't finished with my overseas work, and we were just on a very quick, casual trip to the States, and Carol had been going to school and living with our very good friend Jolly Spear, and it was very fortunate for all of us. The Spears were wonderful friends, and they provided Carol with a place to live while she went to UCLA. It was UCLA or U? And there she met Jack. And the first time we knew that Jack existed, as it were, in her background, was he hadn't arrived yet. We hadn't seen each other, but Carol told us a little bit about it, and Dolly, the woman she was living with, told us even more. And we found out then that she became a member of Campus Crusades, because Jack was doing the leading of it, or at least he was eligible and appropriately so on Campus Crusades. And we feel, being a little bit, I'll not say cynical or prejudiced, but we feel that Carol needed the friendship, which was good and true, but she needed the friendship and the association and the recognition that Campus Crusades gave her. and Jack was in charge of, or one of the leaders of Campus Crusades, and that's how they met. And it wasn't too long after that. I think we're gone. We weren't, otherwise we'd have gone to the wedding. But it was after that that we almost just got a letter saying, well, we're married. And Dolly told us about it, because she went. Dolly was our mutual friend. Cecil, in fact, Carol lived with her for a while. And she told about the day of the wedding that Jack drove up and in his car, and Carol got in, and she makes this point that on the seat, the front seat between them, was a white copy of the Bible. And that was, in my viewpoint, that was both separating and combining them was the Bible. Because it wasn't too long after that that Carol became what she is to this day, pretty much, a devout Christian, and brings you and all your brothers into the realm with all your degrees, and it's a world of its own as far as I'm concerned.
Did you ever meet Jack's father, Cliff Arnold?
No, I'm almost sure I didn't. I heard about him, but I've never met him. And he has a brother too, isn't he?
My dad has a brother named Gary Arnold.
No, I've never met any of them anyhow.
Okay. Let's talk about religious affiliations. Do you know what religion, if any, your father and grandfather were? John Waite and Almond Waite?
My father and my mother never went to any church regularly. They'd go to an organization called Fellowship Alliance. They were great followers of Jud Ben Lindsay, a humanist, if I can use a common term. They weren't anti-religious as such. They were certainly just not religious people to the extreme, as am I. My feeling is that any religion, any intensely, I don't know if that's the right word, intense, but any following, any sect, any fanatics, that's a better word, that has a religious background is wrong. If it comes to that degree of affecting a preacher's life, then to me, axiomatically, it's wrong.
Do you know if John or Almond were they buried? Were their funerals Christian funerals? Were they members of churches? Were they baptized? Do you know of any particular denomination?
They probably. I don't think. If it's probable they were baptized. I don't know whether I was baptized or not. Come to think of it, I don't think I was. But they were very neutral. They might go to church on Sundays. I went to church on Sundays regularly when I was with my step-grandmother.
Lou.
The wonderful, she was to talk about an angel, she was. And very churchy. And I'd go with her at her behest. I'd go anywhere with her at her behest because she was such a wonderful person. And she was the stepmother for Cecil.
What was the what church did Lou send you to? What kind of church was it?
Well, all I know is they used the word Protestant.
They used the word Protestant.
It was not a Catholic, that's all I know.
Okay, you don't know if it was Baptist or
No.
Presbyterian or Church of Christ or anything like that?
No.
This was in Oregon?
I think there
Or
was
Los
in Oregon.
Angeles? Or was it in Los Angeles?
I think they had a...
This is Jeremiah and Lou, so So this would be Oregon, wouldn't it?
They had an organ. Is that what you're saying?
No, I said was it in
Oh, no, it was Redondo.
Redondo?
This is all headquartered in Redondo.
Okay. So a church somewhere in Redondo.
Yes.
Okay. You don't know about the Stevers. You don't know what their religious affiliation
Stevers
was.
is always a name in the background, and the only time I think I was even close to a member of the Stever family when I was just barely, not even in the first grade or kindergarten, but I'd received my first train that, of course, my father couldn't wait to buy because, you know, a boy has to have a train and the father wants to play with a train. And in the group of people that were old enough to play with a train in school age, see, I wasn't even in Berkeley, I don't think I even started kindergarten yet, was a couple of, excuse me, couple of relatives that were about of the high school age, high grammar school to high school age, and I remember their names, the Stever and Oscar and Floyd, and a couple of other names that were related to relationships.
I'll stop you there. Let's talk about. Tell me about the idea you've had and have promoted to a railway that goes across the world.
My
Unite.
railway from pole to pole, called Unite, United Nations International Transportation Entity. That's the acronym. Well, I still have that idea, and I still think it's essential for world peace, literally. The idea of it going from pole to pole is incidental. Going from, not pole to pole, but from the tip of South America to the tip of Africa. Cape Horn to Cape Town, that's it. Cape Horn is the tip of one continent, Cape Town is the tip of the other. And it would go from those two tips of continents interconnected from one to the other by way of a railway up through Canada and up through Siberia, crossing the Bering Sea, a great big loop, and from which could be dozens of branches, of course. My reason for pushing on it is that, first place, transportation is one of the most basic activities that relate people. You go back to the theory of the caveman and their clubs and going to war meetings. The first pseudo-civilized activity required transportation. They had to literally move, either by walking, of course, horseback, on camelback if they were in that part of the world. Whatever it was, it took transportation. And you go through the evolution of civilization, as it were, and the one common thing in all of that is transportation.
Is the concept of a high-speed rail still practical with air travel being so common?
It's even, to me, both being a pilot on the one hand and an engineer on the other, it's even more practical. For one thing, we need to have a transportation which is powered by renewable energy. And you can't put a drop cord on an airplane, but you can generate electricity many, many places in the world. I'm working with a fellow engineer right now, a retired electrical engineer, and we're getting together the latest information on long-distance transmission of electricity. And it probably will involve coaxial cables inside of conduits which are kept at near zero temperature. I mean zero absolute, way below freezing. If you have a conductor that's in very, very low temperature, then the loss in transmitting power is very little. And what we want, what's needed in this future transportation network, is the ability to transfer enormous amounts of power for thousands of miles with very little loss. Because normally you have a lot of loss in transmission. And the only way you can overcome losses to this day is to have tremendously high voltage. That's why you see these high voltage towers go across the country. 20 and 30,000 volts. And the problem with that is that there's still a lot of transmission loss, and there's quite a bit of difficulty in maintaining, and they're vulnerable and so on. But in any event, one way or another, the goal is to have a network of electric power that embraces the world. Literally a network of transmission lines that embrace the world. The source then of that electricity can be varied of various kinds of renewable waterways where they exist and still haven't been developed, solar, which will probably be the main thing, because somewhere in the world, that's why there's need for a long-distance transmission. The world is in sunshine somewhere all the time. Very little is, very seldom, I don't think ever there's a case wherein on the sunny side of the world it's clouded to where a solar generator won't work. So visualize a dozen or so solar networks, solar farms, interconnected, so you have electric power onto this grid all the time. With that, then you power a transportation system. So the transportation system will be basically electrically powered.
You've pitched the idea. You've shared it with some folks. How far has it gotten?
Did what?
How has the idea been received with the powers that be?
By anybody except the people who are in power to do something about it, namely the United Nations. I want the United Nations to have, I have this acronym called UNITE, which means United Nations Intercontinental Transportation Entity. And I want the United Nations, and then the reason I'm not pushing the United Nations organization and its leaders, I've had many letters to Kofi Annan, who is the President Secretary General, and I get nice polite letters back from his office saying, Secretary General wants us to know that you appreciate your letter, but he's very busy right now. That's the end of it. But the reason I'm not pushing that any further is that I want to get some of the people at my own level, senators and representatives, to be more interested in pushing the idea themselves. I think if we're going to be want to be effective in the world in a transportation network, then we should at least be willing to enter it into ourselves. And my first thing that I'm working on right this minute, literally, I've got some partial letters that are already at my desk, is that I want to know whereabouts in the United States can we put in a central station that would be connected to other countries' central stations. Let's think about this. I'm writing to the Department of Interior, I'm writing to the Department of State, I'm writing to my Congress people, I either am or have letters to send, and I want us to soberly think of where in the United States would be the station which is connected to all the other stations of the world. And then from that, set up a right-of-way and start building it.
You went to the United Nations one time and shared the idea. How did that visit go?
I did for certain offices of the United Nations. There's two kinds of answers. It's not our department, so we suggest you get a hold of somebody else. And the other answer from somebody else is that we don't have anybody here that can do it, or we suggest you get a hold of your own congressperson and things like that.
Let's talk about some of the activities you've been in the later part of your life. I think you and Cecil worked at a youth camp, and then you've been involved in this Beyond War group. Just tell me some of the things that you've been involved here.
The Creative Initiative was the name given to it. Yeah, how did we get into it? Oh, I know how we got into it, in all fairness. It was that right here in Inverness, I think his name is Cecil Asman. He had gone to a meeting of a very vocal, intensely dedicated group in College of Marin. And there, he, among a few others, had pledged to contact new people. And we were one of the new people. He knew us. from whatever sources. And so he made arrangements for us to go to a meeting in which this movement was being formed. And the bottom line of the activity was for newcomers to sign up to go to a seminar over a weekend down at Ben Lomond. The original, the background people, the people who were founding this thing, they gosh, talk about short memory loss of names. They had rented, I guess, I was rented at the time, a sort of a meeting house, a place in the woods, at a place called Ben Lomond.
You can fix your ear.
In the Syracuse Mountains. And they were inviting people to come to a weekend seminar where they would, shall I say, expound their philosophy, their idea about world peace, and so on. And we were sufficiently impressed by the dedication of this local person that we went to the meeting, at least. It was held at Olney Hall right here in College of Marin, near San Rafael.
You're okay.
And we agreed to go to this seminar, which was a weekend deal down in the Ben Lomond Mountains. And that's what started us. We were impressed by their dedication and by the sincerity, as it were, of the people that were involved. And so we became members of what, I don't know whether by that time or even a little bit later, it became known as the Creative Initiative Foundation, CIF. So we went to the seminar and got more and more involved, got quite acquainted with some of the senior people. And then when they found that they had leased a piece of property there on the Ben Lomond Mountains and had a series of cabins and were going to have a week-long meeting, Cecil and I agreed to be the cooks. And we were. We went down, they had this nice kitchen with a walk-in refrigerator, and we paid some money, and other people paid money, and they began to get funds. And the world peace nature behind it all, the world peace movement, was one that we certainly subscribed to, the idea, and it became moderately successful. At one, I would say quite successful, when they kept it as they gave it a new name. Well, they gave it a working name called Blessed Man, and they put on a marvelous pageant that took the four major religions, and each one of them was demonstrated and representative on stage. And I was taken a part of a reverend in the Christian part of the pageant. There was the Christian, the Buddhist, the I don't know what it was.
Hindu and Jew, maybe?
Hindu and so on, yeah. Four major religions.
Muslim.
And the thing is, when I was in costume, I may have mentioned this, was really a kick. When I was in costume, getting ready to go from the dressing room up to a place where I was going to stand by to finally walk on stage, as I walked down the aisle, I heard one of the people in the audience murmur to another one and look up and say, "And to think that they got a real pastor." Because they thought I was a real religious person with my gown and my that kind of business. And they said,